The Rosewood Diner sits on the corner of Fifth and Atlantic, a place where the city's forgotten people gather. Nurses after night shifts with dark circles that tell stories of their own. Construction workers cooling their hands on coffee cups stained with their lives, and occasionally men in expensive suits who don't belong anywhere else but have learned to move through the world as if they do. For 5 years, Maria has worked behind the counter, reading people the way ancient scholars read sacred texts. She knows which customers will leave 50-cent tips and which will leave nothing but the ghost of their presence. She knows which ones carry grief like a second heartbeat, which ones are running, which ones are hunting. The Rosewood has always been sanctuary for the city's edge cases, the people society built its walls to forget. Rosa, the owner, has a philosophy. Everyone gets fed. No questions, no judgment, just eggs and toast and the understanding that hunger comes in many forms. But even Rosa's generosity has limits, and those limits are tested on the morning Victor Marquez walks through the door for the first time. One November morning, Victor appears. The man the neighborhood whispers about in parking lots, on fire escapes, in the back rooms of shops that close earlier than they should. There's no doubt who he is, the tailored coat that costs more than Maria makes in a month. The silver rings on hands that people say have done unspeakable things. The way other customers quiet when he sits in booth 7, the one by the window overlooking the street where the city moves past like blood through veins. Maria has heard the stories, the men who disappeared, the businesses that burned, the families that were never quite the same after encountering him. She has never served him before. She has never wanted to. But today, something shifts. Not because Maria changes her mind about who Victor is or what he represents. Not because fear softens her resistance or morality bends under pressure. But because a single photograph, worn and creased, glimpsed for only a moment, reveals that even the most powerful men carry wounds too heavy for the world to see. This is the story of what happens when compassion arrives without permission, when a refusal becomes an invitation, and when the greatest acts of kindness come from people with nothing left to lose and everything left to give. Chapter 1. The Refusal. The morning light cuts through the diner windows at an angle that makes everything look slightly broken. The plastic booths with their cracked red vinyl, the yellowed menu boards behind the counter, the faces of people drinking coffee they don't taste because they're too tired or too worried to taste anything at all. Maria is wiping down the counter when she sees him walk in, and she knows immediately, not from imagination or fear, but from the way the air changes in a room when someone carries that much weight. He's not tall, which somehow makes him more dangerous, more compact, more present in his smallness. Victor Marquez wears a charcoal coat despite the mild November weather, wool that probably costs more than Maria's entire wardrobe combined. His hands, the hands that people say have done unspeakable things, that people cross the street to avoid seeing, that in certain neighborhoods are whispered about the way people whisper about ghosts, rest flat on the table as he sits. They're not drumming, not fidgeting, still as stone, controlled in a way that suggests total mastery over his own nervous system. He doesn't look around the diner, doesn't scan for exits or threats, doesn't need to. His presence fills the space like smoke, like the feeling right before a storm, like the moment before a confession. The old man at the counter stops mid-sip of his coffee, cup frozen halfway to his mouth. The two construction workers in the back booth suddenly become very interested in their breakfast plates. Even Tommy in the kitchen senses it. She can hear him moving more carefully, like he's walking on eggshells that might break into something sharper. Maria pretends not to notice for exactly 45 seconds before she can't pretend anymore. She finishes wiping the counter, moves to refill salt shakers, even though they don't need refilling, reorganizes the napkin dispensers. Anything to stay occupied in the front section, anything to create distance between herself and booth 7. But she can feel his eyes on her like weight, like gravity, like the pull of something inevitable. She recognizes it as the weight of a request that hasn't been spoken yet. Finally, she turns to face him, arms crossed, jaw set. Their eyes meet for only a moment, but it's enough to establish the boundary, the line between service and refusal, between hospitality and resistance, between the woman she is and the woman she refuses to become. "We're closing early today," she says. It's not true. The clock above the kitchen shows 9:47 a.m. They don't close until 4 p.m., but the lie is her weapon, and she wields it with quiet confidence. Victor doesn't argue. This is interesting. She expected threats, or at least the casual arrogance of a man used to getting what he wants. Instead, he nods with something that almost looks like respect for her refusal. He reaches into his coat pocket, slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that doesn't startle people or give them reasons to fear, and pulls out a worn leather wallet. Maria tenses. This is the moment where things could become complicated, where power structures usually reassert themselves. But Victor isn't opening the wallet to show her money or to threaten her. He opens it slowly, almost tenderly, as if showing her something precious beyond measure. His eyes lower to a photograph inside. For a moment, just a breath of a moment, just the space between heartbeats, Maria watches something in his face shift. A tremor runs through his shoulders. A crack opens in the stone. His eyes fill with something that looks like water but probably isn't. She doesn't see the photograph clearly. Just an impression, a figure in light, warm light, the kind of light that comes through a window. Someone small, someone who mattered, someone who still matters. Then he closes the wallet. The tremor passes, the stone reassembles. He stands with the careful precision of a man who has trained his body to obey him absolutely, and moves toward the door without another word. No threats, no promises, no indication that he plans to return. The bell above the glass door chimes as he exits. A small, ordinary sound that somehow carries weight. Maria watches him disappear into the November morning, pushing into the cold that's just starting to settle over the city. The diner settles back into its routine, like a heartbeat resuming. Eggs sizzle in the kitchen. Tommy the cook mutters something under his breath that might be a prayer. The old man returns to his coffee with a hand that isn't quite steady. The construction workers resume their conversation in voices carefully pitched to normalcy. Life continues. The moment passes. But Maria can't shake the feeling that she has just refused something that wasn't a threat at all. She can't stop thinking about the photograph, about that moment when a powerful man's face had broken open to reveal something fragile underneath. She can't stop wondering who was in that picture, or why someone like him carries it the way other people carry amulets or prayers. Chapter 2. The weight of watching 3 days pass. Then 4. Then a full week. Maria works her shifts, breakfast service with the nurses and the third shift workers, whose eyes carry the exhaustion of people who've seen things they didn't want to see. The lunch rush with its chaos and noise and the constant pressure of people wanting to be fed. The quiet afternoons when only the regulars come in, when the diner becomes almost meditative in its stillness. She finds herself watching the door, not consciously at first, but every time the bell chimes, and that sound has become like a heartbeat to her, a rhythm that structures her day. There's a split second where her breath catches, where part of her expects to see the charcoal coat, the careful hands, the face that carries something too heavy to name. Rosa notices. Rosa notices everything. She's worked this diner for 30 years, watched neighborhoods change, watched people arrive and disappear, watched the city's currents shift and flow. She comes to stand beside Maria at the coffee station one Tuesday morning, ostensibly to check the supply, but really just to observe. "You're thinking about him," Rosa says. It's not a question. "No," Maria says. Which is the worst kind of lie, the obvious kind. Maria. Rosa's voice is gentle but firm, the voice of someone who has learned that the only kindness worth offering sometimes is honesty. That man doesn't come to diners for breakfast. He comes to diners to remember that the world has places like this, places where ordinary people live ordinary lives, places his daughter never got to experience. Maria's hands freeze on the coffee pot. His daughter? Rosa crosses her arms, leans against the counter. My husband used to do business with certain people long time ago, before I knew him well. He told me that Victor lost a child, a girl, I think, years ago. Sickness, or maybe an accident. I'm not sure the details. But he said that losing her changed him, made him hard in some ways, but also careful, like he was trying to protect the entire world from grief the way he couldn't protect her. Maria doesn't respond. She sets the coffee pot down on the heating element, watches the steam rise from the carafe. Inside her chest, something shifts. A refusal begins to transform into something more complicated, something that looks a lot like empathy, which is dangerous for people like her who work in places like this and meet people like him. She thinks about Victor's wallet. She thinks about the photograph, that moment of fragility. She thinks about the kind of grief that would carry a picture of someone lost, worn from being held too many times, worn from being remembered too carefully. That's when she asks the question she's been afraid to ask. Do you know his name? The man who came in last week? Rosa's eyes narrow, but not unkindly. Why do you want to know? I don't know, Maria says, and it's true. I want to know who he is. Not what he is. Who? Rosa is quiet for a long moment. Then, his name is Victor. He lost someone, a child. That's all I know that matters. Whatever else Victor did, whatever business he had in the old days, whatever power he built, whatever darkness he created, that grief never left him. Some people become stronger when they lose. They build walls. They accumulate power like armor. But Victor became careful, like he was trying to protect everyone so no one else would hurt the way he hurt. Maria doesn't respond. She returns to the coffee station, arranging cups that don't need arranging, wiping surfaces that are already clean. But Rosa's words settle into her like sediment, like soil, like something that will grow into something she can't control. That night, alone in her apartment, Maria finds herself looking at her phone, typing his name into search engines, finding articles about business dealings, about arrests that didn't stick, about a man whose name appears in contexts she doesn't fully understand but can intuit. She finds one photograph, Victor at some kind of event, maybe 10 years ago, standing next to a woman with kind eyes. She looks at that photograph for a long time, wondering if that was his wife, if that was the woman who stood beside him when grief came. She doesn't sleep well. She dreams about wallets and photographs. She dreams about what it means to carry loss the way other people carry breath. Chapter 3. The second visit. Victor returns on a Wednesday morning. Maria sees him through the pass-through to the kitchen before he sits. She watches him move through the diner, not with swagger or entitlement, but with the careful deliberation of a man navigating a world designed to punish him, a world that has already hurt him in ways that can't be measured. He sits in booth 7 again, the same booth, the booth by the window. He doesn't look at her. He simply sits, and his presence reorganizes the space around him. Maria's hands shake slightly as she approaches. She pulls out her notepad, the small spiral pad with the diner's logo on it, and prepares herself for rejection, for coldness, for the distance that people like him usually maintain. "Coffee?" she asks. Her voice is steadier than her hands. "Please," he says. His voice is quieter than she expected, gentler, almost fragile. "And maybe some eggs? Whatever is fresh." She nods, writes nothing down because she doesn't need to. She pours the coffee, watching it fill the cup, watching the steam rise. She can see his hands on the table, those hands, and they're trembling now, not from cold, from something else, something internal, something that lives in the spaces between heartbeats. "I apologize," Victor says, and she almost doesn't hear him. She's already turning away. But his voice has a quality of sincerity that stops her. "For the other day, I shouldn't have imposed. I shouldn't have come into your diner expecting hospitality when I have no right to it." Maria turns back. She sets the coffee pot down carefully on a neighboring table and slides into the booth across from him. This is against diner policy. This is fraternizing. This is exactly what she told herself she would never do. But the rules that govern her day suddenly feel smaller than the moment in front of her. "You didn't impose," she says. "I did," Victor says. He looks at her directly now, and his eyes carry the exhaustion of someone who has lived too long with too much knowledge. "I come to places like this sometimes, you know. I sit and I watch ordinary life happen. And I try to remember that the world has places where people don't know fear. Diners where nurses come after their shifts and talk about their patients. Places where construction workers can be tired without being dangerous. Places where the worst thing that happens is that the coffee gets cold or the eggs are overcooked." He pauses. His hands, resting on the table, flex slightly. "I have a daughter," he continues, and the words sound like confession, like a burden he's been carrying alone and finally decided to share. "She was 9 when she died. Leukemia. It was very fast. 1 month she was healthy. 1 month after diagnosis, she was gone. The hospital staff did everything they could, but some things—" He trails off. The sentence completes itself in the silence between them. "Some things are beyond anyone's power." Maria's throat tightens. She reaches for her notepad, then sets it down. The gesture feels wrong now. Taking notes would be reducing this moment to transaction. "The photograph in my wallet," Victor says. "That's her, Sophia, from the hospital, the day before she died. She was wearing a pink nightgown that she loved, and I told her a terrible joke. I've never been good at jokes, but I tried." And she laughed. The nurse captured it. That photograph is the last image of her truly happy, before the pain got worse, before the treatment stopped working. He doesn't cry, but something in the way he sits suggests that crying would happen if he allowed himself the luxury of it. "I've carried it for 11 years, he continues, "in this wallet. I touch it sometimes when things get difficult, when I make choices I'm not proud of, when I do things that hurt people. I touch the photograph, and I remember what she wanted to be, who she wanted to become, and I try to be a better version of the man she would have wanted me to be." Maria understands in that moment that she is witnessing something sacred. She's witnessing a confession, a revelation, a man attempting to bridge the distance between who he is and who he wishes he could be. "I'll get you some food," she says quietly. "You look like you haven't eaten well in a very long time." He doesn't argue. He simply nods, and when she brings his eggs and toast back, he eats like a man who has remembered suddenly that his body requires sustenance. And Maria, watching from the counter, understands that refusal and acceptance are sometimes the same conversation, told twice in different languages. CTA for Chapter 3. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of redemption and courage can travel. Chapter 4. The Breakfast Ritual. Weeks pass, 11 weeks to be precise, though neither of them counts. Victor comes every Wednesday morning at 9:00 a.m. It becomes a ritual, something sacred in its ordinariness. Maria begins preparing his usual before he sits down. Eggs over easy, wheat toast with butter on the side, fresh orange juice, black coffee. The ritual expands. She learns his preferences. He likes his eggs warm, but not hot enough that the yolk breaks when he cuts into it. He prefers butter to jam on his toast. He drinks exactly 2 cups of coffee, but never a third. He learns hers. She takes her break at 10:15 a.m., sits in the back booth with whatever book she's currently reading, prefers tea to coffee. During the quiet moments between the breakfast rush and lunch service, Maria sits across from him, and they talk about things that have nothing to do with his business or his pain, though the pain is always present, always underlying the conversation like grief running beneath a river. He asks about her family. She tells him about her mother, still in the old country, living in a small apartment in a village he's never heard of, and how she sends money every month, always the same amount, always on the 15th. He listens the way people listen when they're genuinely trying to understand another human being, not to gather information or leverage, but simply to know. She asks about his life before grief. He tells her about Eleanor, his wife, a woman with kind eyes whom Maria has seen in the photograph, a woman who died 6 years after their daughter. Cancer, he says. Different cancer from Sophia's, as if the universe was teaching me that loss comes in many forms. He pauses. She never forgave me for my business. Not really. She tried, but underneath the trying was always this understanding that I had chosen a path that made us vulnerable. She tried to protect Sophia as much as she could. It wasn't enough. He shows Maria photographs, worn and carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Sophia at 5, gap-toothed and grinning. Elena on their wedding day, radiant and hopeful. Sophia and Elena together in a garden. Sophia standing on her mother's lap, their heads tilted toward each other in a moment of perfect affection. Maria shows him photographs of her mother, her work permit, the letter that arrived 2 months ago saying her mother's blood pressure is rising and the doctor is concerned. They share the weight of distance, the particular grief of loving people on the other side of the world, the helplessness of sending money and prayers and hoping it's enough. Other customers notice the change gradually. The old man at the counter nods at Victor now, not out of fear, but out of something that looks like respect. Rosa stops warning Maria to be careful. Instead, she begins making sure that the eggs are perfectly cooked, that the toast is fresh, that the orange juice is from the good supplier. Even Tommy the cook, who used to tense at Victor's presence, now seems less tense when he's in booth 7. The diner has absorbed him. He has become part of its ecosystem. But there are moments when Maria sees the other Victor, the one the world whispers about, the one the newspapers reference in articles she tries not to read. One Thursday evening, a man comes into the diner looking nervous, sweating despite the cold weather. He looks around, spots Rosa, points toward the back room. They talk in muted voices, and Rosa disappears for 10 minutes. When she returns, she looks different, older somehow, more tired. Later, Maria asks, "Who was that?" "Someone with problems," Rosa says. "Someone Victor helps with sometimes." The implication is clear. Victor's power extends into the neighborhood in ways both visible and invisible. He's not just a man grieving his daughter in booth 7. He is a man who manages territory, who handles disputes, who operates in the shadows the way other men operate in daylight. When Victor returns the next Wednesday, his hands are bruised. Maria notices immediately but doesn't comment. He notices her noticing. "A business negotiation that became complicated," he says simply. "Someone who didn't want to listen to reason. Sometimes reason requires physical persuasion." Maria considers this. She could refuse him again. She could make the same choice she made that first morning. But she understands now that Victor is not one person. He is many people, layered and contradictory, trying to balance darkness with light in a way that most people never manage. "I'm sorry," he says once, after one of these interactions, when his eyes are carrying different weight, when she can sense that something has happened in the world outside the diner. "For what I represent, for the life I've chosen, for bringing that world into this space that you've made clean. I didn't ask you to apologize, Maria says. I asked you to be honest. You are. That's enough. Chapter 5. The Collision. In December, a shift happens in the city's underground economy. A rival family moves territory into the neighborhood. They're younger than Victor by at least 2 decades, hungrier, less interested in the old rules of respect and negotiation, less willing to acknowledge the power structures that have held for years. They want everything: the restaurants, the protection rackets, the loyalty of the street, the allegiance of people who have known Victor for decades. They want Victor's territory, his reputation, his place in the hierarchy of the city's invisible government. One evening, as the December darkness arrives early, they come to the Rosewood Diner. 4 of them, dressed in leather and the arrogance of youth, faces still uncomplicated by true violence or genuine consequence. They sit at the counter and order nothing. Not coffee, not eggs, not the pie that Rosa has just pulled from the oven. They're here to send a message. They're here to establish that Victor's time is ending, his territory is shrinking, his power is becoming optional. Maria recognizes the calculation in their eyes immediately. They're waiting for him. They know he'll come. The diner is his church now, his sanctuary, the place where he goes to remember his daughter and his wife. Of course he'll come. Around 7 p.m., as the evening service winds down and the diner empties toward its final customers, Victor walks through the door. The bell chimes. The sound carries weight. Everyone freezes. Rosa behind the counter, Tommy in the kitchen, the old man in his usual booth, the young couple sharing a slice of pie near the window. Victor sees the 4 men immediately. His body goes still in a way that suggests calculation, assessment, the rapid processing of multiple scenarios. For a moment, and only a moment, Maria watches him calculate the odds, calculate the probability of violence, calculate what leaving the diner would signal to these men and to everyone else, watching the neighborhood's power structure shift. But then his eyes find hers. Their gazes lock across the space of the diner, across the counter where Maria stands with her coffee pot, across the gap between booth 7 and the entrance where Victor still stands. Something shifts in his expression. A choice, a recognition, a refusal of the script he's been handed. He walks past the 4 men without acknowledgement and sits in booth 7, alone. "Maria," he calls, his voice steady and clear, resonating through the suddenly silent diner. "Could I have the usual? And some of that pie Rosa just made, if it's still warm?" The young men exchange glances. This is disrespect. This is weakness. This is a violation of the power dynamics they've come to establish. One of them laughs, a sound without humor. They stand simultaneously, moving toward the booth, hands reaching into their jackets with the casual menace of people who have learned that violence is currency. But Maria moves first. She sets the coffee pot down. She steps out from behind the counter. She walks directly between booth 7 and the approaching men, her body small but immovable, her presence somehow massive in its refusal. "Not today," she says. Her voice is steady. It doesn't shake. It doesn't plead. It simply states fact. Not here. She doesn't have authority. She has nothing but her body and her refusal. She has no power structure to back her up, no organization, no ability to harm these men or prevent them from doing what they came to do. Yet the 4 men stop, confused by the simple fact of her resolve, by her willingness to stand between them and their intended target, by her apparent lack of fear. One of them laughs again. "You're serious?" "I am," Maria says. "This is a place where people eat. This is where nurses come after saving lives. Where old men come to remember their wives, where a man comes to remember his daughter. You're not going to violate that. Not today. Not here." The men look at each other. Some unspoken negotiation happens between them. Finally, one of them nods to another. and they move toward the door, but as they leave, one of them stops and turns back to face Maria. "You're making a mistake protecting him," the man says. "You're making a mistake you won't come back from." Maria doesn't respond. Her hands are shaking, but she keeps them at her sides. She watches the men leave, watches the bell chime as they exit into the December night, watches their car pull away from the curb. Only then does she return to the kitchen, a heart screaming inside her chest like something caged. When she brings Victor his eggs and pie, perfectly cooked, still warm, she sits across from him. Neither of them speaks at first. "Why did you do that?" Victor asks quietly. "Because you've been kind to me," Maria says. "Because you grieved for your daughter in this diner and ordered nothing but coffee. Because you shared photographs with me. Because you're trying to be better than what you were, and the world needs more of that. Because kindness is rarer than cruelty, and I refuse to let cruelty win in a space that belongs to grace." Chapter 6. The photograph shared. The next Wednesday doesn't feel like a normal Wednesday. There's tension in the air, an awareness that something has shifted in the neighborhood's power structure, that the collision between old and new forces has not resolved, but merely paused. Victor sits in booth 7, and Maria can see the weight on him. Heavier than usual, more complex. He reaches into his wallet, but this time he doesn't pull it out to himself. He extends it across the table to Maria, opening it to the photograph, offering it to her in a gesture that feels like trust, like vulnerability, like the deepest kind of revelation. "I want you to keep this," Victor says. "Not permanently, just for now. I want you to understand what I see when I look at this photograph. I want you to know what I'm fighting for when I choose the diner over the street, when I choose to sit with you instead of engaging with those men, when I choose to remember who I was supposed to be." Maria takes the wallet carefully. The photograph shows a child with Victor's eyes, but a smile that's pure light, luminous, unburdened, alive in ways the world should never force to end. Sophia. The name carries weight now. The face has become familiar. "Her name was Sophia," Victor says. "She loved drawing. She would spend hours at the kitchen table with colored pencils, creating entire worlds on paper. She wanted to be an architect and build houses for people who didn't have them. She wanted to design spaces that made people feel safe." He pauses. His hands rest on the table, finally still. "She never got to do any of those things," he continues. "The leukemia took her before she turned 10. The disease didn't care about her dreams. The world didn't care that she was good. That's when I understood that the world doesn't operate on justice. It operates on chance, and cruel chance at that." Maria studies Sophia's face. She tries to imagine this child, to imagine her potential, to understand the magnitude of what was lost. "After she died," Victor says, "I tried to become someone worthy of her memory. Not by changing immediately. I wasn't capable of that. But by carrying her with me, by touching this photograph when I made decisions, by asking myself, would Sophia approve? Would Elena approve? What would they think of the man I'm becoming?" He takes the photograph back, tucks it into his wallet with the reverence of a prayer, a sacrament, something holy. "You saved my life tonight," he says. "Not from those men. I can handle physical threats. You saved my soul. You reminded me that there are people in the world who stand between cruelty and innocence. You reminded me why I've been trying to change. You're everything I hoped Elena and Sophia would have been in the world if they'd had the chance. A person who chooses compassion, even when it costs her." Maria's eyes fill with tears, not from fear, but from the profound sadness of witnessing someone's soul return from exile, of watching a man attempt to reclaim his humanity. CTA for Chapter 6. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Maria and Victor reach more people who still believe in compassion. Chapter 7. The Confession. In the weeks that follow, dark weeks, weeks when the city seems to contract around secrets and pending violence, Victor makes a decision that costs him everything he has built, everything he has been, everything he has worked toward for decades. He meets with people who matter, people whose names carry weight in circles Maria will never access. Lawyers, authorities, federal agents, people with the power to untangle lives from the systems that bind them. He provides information, not casually, not to save himself. He understands that this path leads to prison, to loss of freedom, to the dismantling of the power he's cultivated. He provides information systematically, meticulously, page after page of testimony about how the organization operates, who reports to whom, how money flows, where bodies are buried, which local officials are compromised. He doesn't do this to save himself. He does this to save the city from becoming what he became. He does this for Sophia, and for the idea that one person, even one person, deeply embedded in darkness, can choose differently. He does this for Elena's memory. He does this for the kind of man he might have been if he'd had different chances. He tells Maria what he's doing on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into the process. The morning light is pale, winter light, and booth 7 suddenly feels like a confessional, like a priest's chamber where sins are absolved through the act of speaking them aloud. "They'll come for me," he says. "Not immediately, but eventually. The men I worked for will not forgive this. They'll consider it the ultimate betrayal. In their world, loyalty is the only currency that matters, and I'll have spent mine." "Then why do it?" Maria asks, though she knows the answer. She's known the answer since the first morning he walked into the diner. "Because Sophia would have," he says simply. "Because she wanted to build houses for people who didn't have them. Because her dream was about creating something, about making the world safer and better and more beautiful. And I spent my life doing the opposite, tearing down, taking from people, making the world smaller and colder. This is my attempt to build something. To create a future where fewer Sophias are stolen from the world by violence and corruption." Maria reaches across the table and takes his hand. It's the first time they've touched beyond the normal interactions of service, passing the coffee pot, settling the bill, the brief contacts that structure their relationship. "I'm proud of you," she says. Victor looks at their joined hands like he's never seen such a thing before, like kindness is a language he's been learning slowly all these months, and this gesture is finally making sense to him. Chapter 8. The Absence. The call comes on a Tuesday evening. Rosa receives it at home. Her voice changes on the phone. Something hardens. She calls Maria immediately, tells her to come in early the next morning, that they need to talk. Maria knows before Rosa says it. She's felt it coming, the inevitable endpoint of the choice Victor made. She arrives at the diner at 6 a.m., before breakfast service, before any customers arrive. Rosa is waiting with coffee already brewed, her face carrying the exhaustion of having borne bad news alone through the night. "Victor's been arrested," Rosa says. "Federal charges. His testimony is part of an investigation into organized crime. It went federal last night. FBI, Homeland Security, maybe others. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Not as punishment exactly, but as the consequence of what he chose to do." Maria sits down in booth 7 without permission, without thinking. The booth that has become Victor's church, his sanctuary, his place of transformation. She sits in the space where he always sat, and she understands what Victor must have understood when he made his choice, that some acts of grace require the surrendering of everything else, that redemption sometimes costs your freedom, that becoming better sometimes means losing yourself completely. She doesn't cry, not at work, not with Rosa watching her, but that night, alone in her apartment, She understands what Victor understood when he held that photograph for 11 years. That love doesn't require presence. It requires remembrance. It requires the commitment to honor what someone meant by living differently because of them. It requires choosing again and again to be the kind of person they would have wanted you to be. She goes back to work. She pours coffee for the old man at the counter. He orders eggs and asks where Victor has been, and she lies and says he's traveling. She takes orders. She brings food. She returns to the rhythm of service. But booth 7 sits empty now, a void shaped like redemption, a space that carries all the weight of absence. The diner feels smaller without him. Or maybe it just feels more honest about what it actually is, a place where ordinary people come to experience the grace of being fed, being seen, being remembered. Without Victor, that truth becomes more obvious. His presence had made it sacred. His absence reveals its sacredness was always there, just waiting to be recognized. Chapter 9. The photograph returned. A letter arrives at the diner 3 months later, addressed to Maria in care of the Rosewood. Her name is written in careful handwriting. Victor's handwriting. She recognizes it immediately from the notes he sometimes left with his payment. Inside the envelope is a single item, the worn photograph of Sophia smiling in a hospital bed, luminous and alive and forever frozen at 9 years old. Attached to the back of the photograph is a note in Victor's careful handwriting, folded into thirds, worn from being handled. Maria, I'm giving this to you because I've learned that some burdens are meant to be shared. Sophia wanted to build houses for people who didn't have them. You've built a sanctuary for someone who had nowhere else to go. You stood between cruelty and innocence without weapons or power. You chose kindness when it would have been easier to choose fear. I'm writing this from prison, and I want you to know that every day I think about our conversations. I think about the eggs you cooked, the way you listened without judgment, the moment you stepped between me and those men. That moment changed everything for me. It reminded me that transformation is possible, that grace exists, that humanity isn't something reserved for people who have lived clean lives. Take this photograph. Remember her. Remember that even in darkness, light is possible. Remember that refusal can become invitation. Remember that kindness is the only revolution that ever truly matters. You showed me that I could still matter, could still choose differently, could still honor the people I loved by becoming someone worthy of their memory. The world needs more people like you. Thank you for seeing me, not as what I was, but as who I was trying to become. So believe Victor. Maria holds the photograph for a very long time. She looks at Sophia's face, that luminous, unburdened joy, that smile that carries no knowledge of what comes next. She understands now that some acts of grace ripple forward across years, across lives, across the distance between refusal and acceptance, between judgment and mercy. She frames the photograph and hangs it behind the counter at the Rosewood Diner, in a place of honor where it will watch over the space between service and being served, between judgment and grace, between the people the world has forgotten and the small, ordinary acts of kindness that remind them they were never truly lost. The photograph becomes part of the diner's landscape. Regular customers ask about it. Rosa tells the story, carefully, respectfully, without betraying Victor's trust. A man and his daughter. A moment frozen in time. A reminder of why this place matters. Epilogue. On quiet mornings, before the breakfast rush arrives, before the world reasserts its demands and its noise, Maria stands at booth 7, the one by the window overlooking the street. The city moves past below, indifferent and urgent, full of people carrying their own photographs, their own wounds, their own capacity for change. She remembers Victor's hands trembling as he opened his wallet that first morning. She remembers refusing him, and how that refusal became invitation. She remembers Sophia's smile frozen in time, a light that outlasted both the darkness and the man who carried it, The bell above the diner door chimes as another customer enters, someone new, someone carrying their own stories. The day begins again, ordinary and sacred, full of the quiet possibility that even in a world shaped by violence and loss, two people can meet over coffee and demonstrate that the human heart is stronger than any force designed to break it. Somewhere, in a prison cell, a man holds no wallet, but he carries something more valuable: the knowledge that his refusal to remain who he was became a doorway to who he might have always been. He writes letters that Maria will receive for years. Letters about what he's learning, letters about his fellow inmates, letters that show a man continuing to transform, continuing to choose differently, continuing to honor the daughter and wife he lost by becoming someone worthy of their memory. And in a diner on the corner of 5th and Atlantic, a waitress serves breakfast to strangers, understanding finally that every act of service is a small revolution, and every person, no matter how lost, deserves to be remembered as more than their worst decisions. The rain falls, the neon signs hum, the city breathes, and in booth 7, an empty chair holds all the space in the world, space for grief, space for redemption, space for the quiet understanding that compassion is the only force that ever truly changes anything. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of Victor and Maria. See you in the next one.